Please rise.
Thank you. You can be seated. All right. First of all, we would just want to make a record. I think the parties are aware of that. That yesterday, when Mr. Bogan was trying to introduce defense exhibits 1864 and 65, the 65 was really 1863 if you look at the sticker closely. And so we haven't made appropriate changes to the records, but we've noted it in the records, is my understanding. So with that, I think the sorry. No, I'm not looking at you.
Okay.
I'm looking at somebody else and they know who it is. So go ahead. You have a record to make?
Well, before we move off of that, we reviewed it, no objection.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Judge, we wanted to just see if we could inquire of the court and opposing counsel if the parties are amenable to the idea of expanding the closing argument to 2 hours and 30 minutes.
I was already thinking that was appropriate. So from my perspective, I was going to suggest that.
Very good. That's all we wanted to say. Sounds like we're on board.
Okay. I just didn't think that was enough time for you.
Thank you, Judge.
So with that, can we bring in the jury? Yes, sir. And do we have a witness up? Because I don't have him on mine. But is he up there? Yeah. Okay. That's okay. It's a bandwidth thing. And get in the picture? No. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And no, don't touch it. Don't touch it. I think that's a bandwidth thing. Don't worry about it. As long as it's coming up there, it's all we need. Yes. Okay, and everything else is going out.
Judge, on that topic, I'm sorry to bring this up.
Yes.
Have you thought about the sequence of how you wanted to do that as far as lunch breaks, morning breaks, etc.?
Yep. And I can't make a decision until I know further on where you guys are in terms of when we're done. So I have thought about it. I didn't assume, but Aaron assumed that you guys didn't want to break over lunch. But I didn't see a problem with that. But if you guys have a problem with that, then I'll try and adjust that.
Okay. Maybe we can talk about that at the jury instructions conference.
I think that's a good idea. But I have to tell the jury when to come back. So we have to kind of, I've got sort of a game plan. I'll talk to you before.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you up at the bench before we release them.
Okay. Thank you, Judge. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Very well.
All right. Thank you. Everybody rise, please. Okay. right, we can be seated. Next defense witness.
Defense respectfully calls James Samino, who's appearing remotely.
All right. Mr. Simino, I don't think you can see me, but would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bogan.
And Mr. Samino, I don't know if I'm in your frame right now, but I'm Justin Bogan, defense attorney for Mr. Mark Redwine. Can you introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name, please?
Sure. So my name is James Simino. And to spell that, it's Simino. I'm the district ranger for the Columbine Ranger District. So the Columbine Ranger District is the area around Durango, Silverton, and Bayfield in the San Juan National Forest. And I got here in July of 2019.
And where are you broadcasting from and what are you doing?
Sure. So I'm broadcasting from Plains, Montana. I'm here working as an agency administrator on a wildfire on the Lolo National Forest.
Is that the reason you're up in Montana instead of down here?
Yeah.
We need a verbal answer, sir.
Oh, yes, that is. I have an experience level that is the highest for the agency when it comes to wildfires. So when a type 1 incident management team comes in, I'm asked to come be that agency administrator, whether it's on my unit or going out to help other forests.
In your capacity as the district ranger for the National Forest in these parts, are you familiar with grazing leases and grazing practices on National Forest land in the Vallecito area?
Yes, I am.
And are you familiar with what those practices were from 2012 to 2015?
You know, in general, I can tell you the on-off dates and who was permitted and where the permit boundary is. But as to specifics of what happened in that actual season, I don't have that information for you.
And do you have before you a map that lays out the Vallecito allotment for grazing?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And can you explain to the jury first what an allotment is for grazing, and second, what the Vallecito allotment is?
Sure. So in general, we issue term grazing permits to ranchers who want to graze livestock on the national forest. They're 10-year permits, and in particular, the Vallecito allotment. Acreage-wise, I couldn't tell you exactly what it is. I don't have that sitting here in front of me. But it's a permit that runs from June 21st to October 12th. And the permittee is allowed to put on 346 cow-calf pairs in that period of time. So cow-calf pair being mother cow and the calf with it. And then there's also a portion of that allotment where 50 cow-calf pairs are able to graze another portion, and they move together with that other 346 later in the season.
Your Honor, at this time, by stipulation, I would seek to admit defense 1925 and publish to the jury.
That's fine. It'll be admitted.
And can I just ask one clarifying question? I do stipulate.
Yes.
That allotment on that map, sir, that's going to be, I assume, accurate back in 2012 as well?
Yeah, the boundary hasn't changed since 2012.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Yep.
You can publish.
Thank you. And Mr. Samino, I'm going to ask you to look at your copy of the map. We have a copy here in the courtroom.
Judge, may I?
Yes.
Thank you.
And in the map of the Vallecito allotment, is the allotment.
Hold on, Mr. Johnson, if you want to go out in the audience and off to the side, you can. I just don't want you in the jury. You can go over by the door too, I guess. Okay.
Go ahead, please, the court. Mr. Samino, is the actual allotment where cattle are permitted to graze, is that denoted by kind of a checkered line that's got white and brown checks around it?
Correct. That's
And
the
I need
allotment boundary. Yes, that's the allotment boundary.
And safe to say that allotment boundary goes from the southern tip of Alicito Reservoir on the east side of it, up past Tuckerville, and almost to an area called Cave Basin. Does that sound right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then on the west side, the same allotment winds around the Valecito campground and a little bit past the west side of the Valecito Reservoir, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And within that grazing allotment, Runlet Park is included in that area, correct?
That's correct.
So cattle graze in Runlet Park, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And you can't speak to the specificities of what every cow pair is doing, but if it's within this checked boundary from June to October, cattle are going to be in that area, safe to say?
Yeah, so at some time during that period, there's the permittee develops a rotation as they move around that allotment. And so they may not be in one place for that whole length of time. They're being moved around that entire allotment. There's different pastures within that allotment.
And you explained briefly a little while ago what a calf pair was. Can you reiterate that for the jury, please?
Sure. A cow-calf pair is just a mother cow and her calf of that year.
So if you have, go ahead.
There are other times where we allow, so many bulls to go with so many cow-calf pairs as well. But the overall number for that allotment is 346 plus the 50 that graze in East Creek.
Okay. So 346 cow-calf pairs. So that's one mama cow and one calf, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then does the permit also contemplate bulls or the number of bulls? Can you speak to those numbers?
Yeah, in general, it would be reduced from that 346. But in general, we allow like one bull for every 20 cow-calf pair.
Okay. So, and safe to say these numbers of 346 for cow-calf pairs, that was the cap for 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015.
Correct. Yes.
So if we got one mom cow, one baby calf, and some bulls, it sounds like that's in the neighborhood, maybe a little bit north of about 700 cattle in this allotment, correct?
Yes, correct.
And I think you iterated what the permit dates are. Can you reiterate when cattle would be permitted in that allotment during 2012 through 2015, what the start date and what the exit date would be?
Yep. So the date that they can go on the National Forest is June 21st. The off date when they are supposed to be removed off the National Forest is October 12th.
Nothing further for this witness, Judge.
Any cross?
Just briefly, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you for your service with the fires. I just have a couple of questions for you.
Some of the jurors can't see what you're doing.
Oh, right. So, sir, by November, the cows are all going to be out of here. Is that accurate?
They should. There is an occasion where permittees have a hard time gathering up all their livestock at the end of the season, and there may be a few stragglers on. I can't speak to 2012, 2013, whether that occurred or not. I don't have that information.
Okay. And you talked about a particular person having the allotment for the 346 cows, right?
That's correct.
Who was that?
So the gentleman's name is Kenan Decker.
And did Kenan Decker, did you describe when you sent the map over kind of the general area where his cattle started on the west side of the reservoir?
I did not.
Okay.
I just
Mr. Johnson?
the map that I sent was just the general map with the allotment boundary on it.
This side of
And
the
then
map,
this
and then
side.
everybody can see.
Okay. So if I understand you right, sir, at different years, the cows are going to sort of work different areas of this entire allotment. Am I right?
That's correct.
And so on any given year, they might be on the west side of the reservoir?
So I would say every year they are on the west side of that reservoir. It's usually a small number that moves over onto the east side with the rest of the herd.
Okay. And by the east side, do you mean south of, is there a Pine River on the east side?
Yes, there is. Or on the map it shows as Los Pinos.
Okay, Los Pinos. So Los Pinos cuts kind of across below Runlet Park. Am I right?
That's correct.
And then is it a typical pattern for the cows to come from the east side, or I'm sorry, from the west side over to the east side by Pinos River?
I think they come in off of East Creek, and then I don't know exactly where into the allotment they group up with a bigger herd.
Okay.
And it could vary from year to year based on conditions out there, whether there's water, whether there's enough forage, whether they've changed their rotation for the year. Sometimes permittees will move them into different parts of the allotments at different times of the year based on, a change every year.
Okay. So we know that they use that west side and probably that east side, and then sometimes they use Runlet Park as well, I assume?
Correct.
But on any given year, at any given time, we don't know which areas here that they are. Like, for example, 2013, 2014.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I don't have any more questions.
Okay, redirect. Hold on. Just leave it on.
Based upon your experience and your knowledge about the Vallecito allotment for grazing, would it be uncommon for people to see cattle in Runlet Park in 2015?
So my experience with that allotment is the last 2 years. So I think I can speak to that. It would just be conjecture in 2015 because I have no information about it. But I think based on the 2 years where I've seen animals, we talked with a permittee this spring, and they do use Runlet Park. What time of year and the total numbers I couldn't tell you, but it does get used, and people would
Nothing
see them
further,
there.
Judge. I'm sorry, nothing further, Judge.
Okay, any questions from the jury? All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Simino. You are excused and appreciate all the effort to testify.
Thank you.
We're waiting. Becca, you'll let me know? All right. Doing one screws up the other, so we're good? Okay, we're good. So, next defense witness?
Got a defense recalls. He's called once by the prosecution, Tom Cowing.
All right.
And given that he's associated with an adverse party, we'd request to ask him leading questions. I think that will also expedite matters.
I think that's provided for by rule.
Judge, and may I comment on that?
You may.
I do think if it becomes a situation where he's hostile, defense can resort to leading questions, but he's an investigator and he's being called by the defense. So until that happens, it'd be the people's position it shouldn't be leading questions. Now, if it's impeachment, I think that's a little different too.
That's not what the rule says. Come on up, Mr. Kelly. My ruling stands. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm in applying perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, sir. Have a seat. And have the microphone pointed towards you, Mr. Moran.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good morning.
Morning.
Investigator Cowling, will you please state your full name and spell your last name for the record?
Yes. First name Tom, last name Cowling, C-O-W-I-N-G.
Investigator Cowling, I want to start with the interview you did with Angela Lee on November 20th, 2012. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you recall that you committed what was discussed on that day to writing in a report from November 20th, 2012?
Yes.
And in your report, after briefly speaking with Ms. Lee, you record that she was absolutely sure she saw Dylan Redwine on November 19th, 2012. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also learned on that day that when she'd seen Dylan, she believed it to have been at 2 o'clock. Is that right?
Yes.
And that she said that that happened in the vicinity of a location called Vallecito Market. Is that right?
Correct.
She spotted Dylan walking northbound, she believes, and she thought that that was 2 to 3 blocks north of Vallecito Market.
Correct.
The individual she saw that she thought was Dylan, she said that that child was wearing a backpack. Is that right?
Yes.
And she said that that child was accompanied, well, she wasn't saying child, I guess she was saying that that teen was accompanied by another teen male his age. Is that right?
Correct.
She said that that teen male had a backpack too. Is that right?
Yes.
She also said that he had dark hair, correct?
Correct.
She went on to say that she was, quote at least from your report, positive that who she saw was Dylan Redwine.
Yes.
And she was positive she saw Dylan Redwine because she had delivered mail to his father's home on County Road 500, right?
Yes.
She also included in her description of being positive that she had been delivering mail to that home for a long time.
Correct.
She was absolutely sure because she said she was accustomed to seeing Dylan at the residence.
Mr. Joseph?
It's all right, Judge. It's a different question. I just don't want to hear the same questions over and over.
Okay. Can you answer that, please?
Yes.
And she said she was absolutely sure because she knows what he looks like.
Correct.
She mentioned that she looked at them. Is that right?
Yes.
And they looked at her.
Correct.
She mentioned that she did not wave to them. Is that right?
Yes.
And they did not wave to her.
Correct.
What she described in observing this teen she said she was sure was Dylan was that she had to wait a short time for them to walk past her vehicle.
Correct.
And she said she had to wait for them, and she looked at them before she could pull back out onto the road.
Correct.
Are you aware that as time passed, she became less sure of her identification?
Yes.
And that ultimately there was a point where she indicated a diminished willingness to continue interacting with law enforcement?
Yes.
I beg your pardon if you mentioned this, but she did mention that she knew what Dylan looked like, right?
Objection has been answered.
Been asked and answered, Mr.
Beg your pardon. I want to switch gears here a little bit now. You participated in response to Mr. Redwine's house on November 20th, 2012. Is that right?
Yes.
You went in his house to look through the house on November 20th, 2012, and to interact with him. Is that right?
Yes.
On that occasion, you conducted a careful search because law enforcement knows that occasionally kids who have not returned home are in fact in the home hiding. Is that right?
Correct.
Your search was so thorough that you looked in bins. Is that right? B-I-N-S for the record.
Yes.
You looked at the vacuum filter in the vacuum. Is that right?
Yes.
You looked in the laundry. Is that right?
Yes.
And had there been anything in those locations that suggested a major bloodletting, a dismemberment, you would have collected that evidence at that time. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
You wrote at that time that on November 20th in Mr. Redwine's house, you did not see anything suspicious.
Correct.
Do you recall at around that time that you looked at Dylan Redwine's Facebook?
Yes.
And you observed that he had not posted anything on Facebook for several days?
Correct.
In the days between November 20th and 21st to November 29th, you had lots of phone calls. Is that fair?
Yes.
Objection to relevance.
I'm going to let it see where it goes. You may be right. I don't know. Go ahead.
A lot of those calls were from psychics. Is that right?
Correct.
People telling you that they'd had visions of where...
Haven't we heard this already? I mean, is this something new?
I do believe that this information has been provided. It was curtailed because of the scope of direct examination. I'm happy to move on. I don't know that we need to reiterate this
Thank you.
in too much detail. On November the 30th, there was some brief mention of this, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, but that Mr. Redwine showed up and gave you his computers. Is that right?
Objection, this whole line's been done.
I think that's been done too.
I'll move on from that, but I just want to, well, I think the photographs of Mr. Redwine were mentioned too. With respect to follow-up on tips, one psychic tip took you to New Mexico. Is that right?
Correct.
Switching gears here a little bit, you mentioned the Vicedo Country Market that's near where Angela Lee thought she'd seen Dylan Redwine. Is that right?
Yes.
At that market, there was an employee by the name of Judy Sundblom. Do you recall her?
Yes.
Objection of relevance, and we may need to approach Judge.
You got one, come on up. Go ahead.
Switching gears here, sir. You, during the pendency of the investigation, also had an opportunity to interview Corey Redwine. Is that right?
Yes.
And do you recall that he told you he did not bleed in the living room at one point?
Yeah. I do believe, yes, I can read the report.
Okay, I didn't hear the answer.
If I could refresh my memory.
Yes.
What page, counsel?
Let me know if that refreshes your recollection.
Yes.
What I was referring you to, I think, was that he didn't recall Dylan bleeding in the living room. Is that what you were just refreshed on?
Yes.
But in fact, and I beg your pardon, Corey does say that he did bleed while he was at his dad's house. He's hiking in the woods behind his dad's house. He cut his finger.
Corey, yes.
And he remembers that he had to bandage the cut.
Correct.
And he also recalled an occasion where he vomited at his father's house.
I don't recall.
May I approach?
Objection of relevance.
I'm sorry, would it refresh your recollection?
Well, if it's a relevant objection, I'm not going to go.
I mean, there's multiple objections. It's already been covered. I don't think it's impeachment of anything.
It's not impeachment.
All right. I'd forgotten he acknowledged that. I'll move on. Lastly, sir, there was an occasion in apparently approximately April of 2013 where law enforcement seized Mr. Redwine's Dodge pickup truck. Do you recall that? If I said 2014, I apologize. I think it was 2013.
February 5th, 2014, is that what you're referring to?
The event where law enforcement seized his Dodge pickup truck, and there was some discussion about whether the battery had been replaced in it. Do you recall that?
Yes.
When was the truck seized?
I know of the seizure on February 5th of 2013.
And
Correction, 2014.
the condition of the battery in the Dodge stood out to law enforcement. Is that right?
Yes.
And the reason it stood out was because law enforcement had a notion that the battery had been replaced in that Dodge based on something Mr. Redwine had said. Is that right?
Correct.
And then you went back and reviewed the recording and learned that what Mr. Redwine was in fact talking about was the battery in the ATV. Is that right?
Correct.
So somewhere in approximately April of 2013, you learned that he had replaced that battery for the four-wheeler.
Correct.
Moment, please. Thank you, sir. I think the prosecutor will have some questions.
Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Investigator Cowling, let me start with the conversation with Corey Redwine. So you recall what counsel was just asking you about the discussion with Corey about whether he bled in the living room?
Yes.
And the purpose of this conversation was to determine, because there had been blood in the living room, whose it would be.
Correct.
And Corey wasn't told why you were going to ask him that question. He was simply asked to provide additional information that could be compared against the evidence.
Yes.
And Mr. Redwine was cooperative and gave you the only example he could think of, right?
Yes.
And specifically what he said was, when you asked him if he recalled bleeding in Mark's home while he was there, he remembered hiking in the woods behind his father's house last spring, recalled cutting his finger, but the wound was superficial and not bleeding profusely. Is that what he said?
Yes.
Okay. And he remembered showering after taking the hike and putting a bandage on the cut, right?
Correct.
He did not remember bleeding in the living room at any time.
Correct.
Thank you. With regard to Angela Lee, let's talk about that because you were asked quite a few questions on that topic. So you're aware of the overall investigation as one of the primary investigators, right?
Yes.
And were you assigned initially to call Angela Lee back after a tip came in?
Yes.
And is this one of roughly 1,000 tips in the case?
It is.
A lot of tips about sightings of Dylan in the case?
Yes.
And on this particular case, when Angela Lee told you that she was certain that she had seen Dylan, was that on a phone call to her?
Yes.
Was that a relatively brief phone call?
Yes.
And was someone else assigned to follow up with this one tip out of all those tips?
Yes.
All right. And when she reported that to you, one of the questions you weren't asked was, throughout the entirety of the investigation, is this the only two kids she reported seeing that day?
Yes.
So there weren't multiple sets of two kids walking together that she'd seen?
Correct.
Just this one time north of the market when she thought she saw Dylan?
Yes.
Now, that tip was ultimately assigned to Tanya Goldbright, at least initially, right?
Correct.
And Ms. Lee was interviewed multiple times on this topic, am I right?
Yes.
As early as November 24th, she was interviewed by Tanya in more detail in person about that tip, right?
Correct.
And as early on as that, November 24th, the first in-person interview, she was clear it was about 70% sure she'd seen Dylan.
Objection, this requires testimony of another individual here, so.
Your response?
Judge, I'm just laying out the entirety of the statements in the investigation. I think that Investigator Cowling's aware as one of the primary investigators who knew of this tip, so that's why I'm asking. Further, I'd note she's already testified in court as to this content.
I'm going to allow this question to go forward for the sole purpose as to when it was established that Angela Lee was not 100% sure about her identification. You're talking November 24th of 2012?
Yes, Your Honor.
And that's the only reason you can consider this, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead.
Your Honor,
Yes.
I'm sorry that this will appear as quibbling, but I believe that to be the truth of the matter, and that would be the primary basis for excluding this statement without the proper witness. So
I understand that, and that's why I'm limiting what it can come in for. It is a relevant issue as to whether she changed her mind, whether or not there's things misheard. I mean, I can go on and explain it. I don't want to any further than that. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. So just with regard to that, that was, I guess, 3 or 4 days, 4 days later, right there within 5 days of the sighting, she was already saying that in the first in-person interview.
Yes.
Okay. In that interview, the purpose of the investigation in that interview was actually to show her pictures of all of Dylan's friends on Facebook, right?
Correct.
And the purpose of that was because you were taking that tip very seriously, that Dylan at that point could be alive and there could be one of his friends out there that had seen him.
Correct.
And only 5 days after he went missing, that could lead you to Dylan, right?
Yes.
But she was unable to identify any of them, which was consistent with your investigation overall, right?
Your Honor, objection to inquiring any further about what she's seeing or believing.
I'm going to allow this question to go forward. It was testified to anyway, so it really doesn't matter.
So she was unable to identify any of Dylan's friends as being the second child in this instance.
Yes.
And then as it went on in the investigation, you did a whole lot of work in trying to figure out if there was anyone who had seen or heard from Dylan on November 19th of 2012, right?
Yes.
All right. And after all that work was done, you circled back as an investigative team to Ms. Lee for other options, right?
Yes.
And then by March 4th of 2013, there was an interview again with her with Ms. Goldbright.
Correct.
And she was asked again how sure she was, right?
Correct.
And she was asked about how often she'd seen Dylan and how recently, generally. She was asked those types of questions.
Yes.
Okay. And I won't ask you the answers, but I just want to place time frames on the things she's already testified to. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So those were the topics of the March 4th interview, was how often she saw Dylan and how recently, right?
Correct.
And then she was talked to again on March 6th of 2013 by Tanya Goldbright, right?
Correct.
And consistent with all these interviews, she again was asked about how sure she was about having seen Dylan or not seen Dylan, right?
Yes.
And then finally on March 7th, she was interviewed again by Tanya Goldbright, but also Brandon Dyer was there, right?
Correct.
And the purpose of that meeting was to have her go through yearbooks. And at this stage of the investigation, you were looking at other options besides the fact that that was Dylan based on all the information you have.
Correct.
And so she was to go through those yearbooks and see if maybe it was a couple of other kids.
Correct.
And then come later on the 7th, there were a couple of kids who had come to law enforcement's attention who weren't in the yearbooks because they were homeschooled, right?
Yes.
And then the law enforcement had reason to believe that those children might be children she should look at photographs of.
Yes.
And then she was finally presented those two photographs to look at.
Correct.
And then even on October 19th of 2020, she was again interviewed and asked the same questions about her certainty in seeing Dylan.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that your interview with her over the phone that first time is an outlier in terms of what was explained?
Yes.
I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Okay, redirect.
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Okay, any questions from the jury? Okay, looks like we have at least one. So, Mr. Cowling, this is a yes or no question or answer? Okay. Were the two kids that Angela Lee saw with a question mark behind it, were they interviewed?
Yes.
Okay. And the next question I don't want you to answer, and did they say they saw Angela that day? That would be a hearsay response, which wouldn't comply with the rules of evidence. So we're not going to have a response for that. So any follow-up, Mr. Mayor?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Just one question, Judge.
Sure.
Investigator Cowing, they were interviewed prior to Angela Lee being shown the photographs and asked about them, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. You can step down, I assume. You're okay with that? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Next defense witness?
Jann.
Okay. Come on up, Ms. Smith. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, sir. Thank you. Have a seat.
May it please the court.
Go ahead.
Can you state and spell your last name for the record and the jury, please?
Jann Smith, Smith.
And how are you currently employed, Ms. Smith?
I am the La Plata County Coroner.
And how long have you been doing that for?
In the position of coroner, about 10 years, but as a deputy coroner, about 10 more on top of that.
And what are the qualifications one needs in Colorado to be a county coroner?
You have to be a resident of the county, have to have no felonies, and you have to be 21 years old.
What sort of training have you obtained to be the La Plata County coroner?
I am certified through the state as a coroner for the Colorado Coroner Association, and I'm also nationally certified through the American Board of Medial Legal Death Investigators.
What is that?
A national certification.
And were you the county coroner for La Plata County in 2013 and 2015?
Yes, sir.
And how long had you been the coroner in 2013?
Couple of years.
Couple of years.
The actual coroner?
Yes, ma'am.
Couple of years.
Okay. And then in 2015, a couple more years after that?
Correct.
Okay. And can you explain to the jury what the responsibilities are of the county coroner, what you do?
I'm responsible for determining the cause and manner and death of an individual.
And generally, when does that come up? How do you get pulled into those situations where you have to make those determinations?
Whenever I get the call.
And who's supposed to call you?
It depends. Law enforcement usually calls me through dispatch. Sometimes I will get a call through like the hospice people or an individual that way.
Does the law mandate that when law enforcement comes across a dead body that they are to contact you?
Yes.
And does the law mandate that when law enforcement comes across a dead body, they are to contact you as soon as practicable?
Yes.
And then what are your responsibilities after you've been informed by law enforcement that there's a situation, a body you got to investigate?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, but I don't necessarily have to go to the scene where the body is. It depends on the situation.
Why is that?
That's my determination. I mean, it just depends on the situation.
Right. It's depending on the situation, in your discretion, in your determination, you decide whether or not to go to the scene where a body has been found, if I understand you correctly.
Correct.
And safe to say, according to the law in Colorado and the duties of a coroner, should law enforcement touch or remove a body from a place that they find it before contacting you?
No.
And safe to say, in your discretion,
Your Honor, I'm going to object on the leading questions here. I know that we're trying to move quickly, but
This is your witness,
Okay.
Mr. Rogan.
what's the typical practice in your experience in La Plata County when law enforcement finds a body?
They call dispatch for me to respond, and then depending on the situation, whether I respond or not.
And again, that's in your discretion.
Correct.
Turning your attention to this case, were you informed that some of Dylan Redwine's post-cranial remains had been found?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury what post-cranial is?
The brain. I guess I'm not sure.
No, that's fine. I'll rephrase the question. Do you recall if you were informed whether some femurs, tibia, clavicle were found?
Yes.
Okay. And were you informed where those were found?
Yes.
And do you know how soon you were informed about those findings after they were in fact found?
Soon. I don't know. I can't tell you if it was an hour or 2 hours, but yes, right after they were actually, when law enforcement went up to some bones, they didn't know if they were animal or human, but they said, we are going to go check it out. They brought them down. We had them checked, and yeah, I was there when that happened.
Right. And you're saying that was a couple hours after they were found?
I don't really know. I don't remember.
Do you recall doing an interview with me and my investigator, Mr. Les Lister, and informing us that you got called 2 to 3 days after the remains were found?
No.
We're looking at a transcript of that interview.
No, I
Refresh your
don't remember.
recollection.
Could you give us a date?
Yes, I thought I said on May 30th, 2019.
Thank you. You ready?
Yes, I am. Do you recall going up to the scene where law enforcement told you the remains were found?
No.
You don't recall going up to Middle Mountain to see where some of the remains were found?
No, I went up to Middle Mountain to the when I first was informed that there was a possibility someone was missing, I went up to their command center, and they showed me the possible area where this individual could be.
And when they showed you the possible area where this individual could be, was that prior to or after the postcranial remains had been found, the femurs and tibia?
Prior.
Okay. And after the remains were found, did you ever go to that area?
No.
Did you ever conduct any investigation of the area where the postcranial remains were found?
No.
Understanding you got the call relatively soon that the postcranial remains had been found, were you informed that that area had been sealed off?
Yes.
And how long was it sealed off for?
No, I don't know.
Could have been sealed off for a couple hours, could have been sealed off for longer than that, you don't know.
Correct.
Okay. And again, in your discretion, you didn't go there at that time, right? We need a verbal answer for the record.
I said no, I did not.
Okay.
And you really do need to speak up. Bring to the microphone. I don't know if the jury can hear you or not, and I'm close. I'm having trouble.
Okay.
And I know you can talk louder than that.
True.
Okay.
And you've already testified that you believe you were informed about this first set of remains 2 to 3 hours afterwards, correct?
Approximately. I had to have time to bring them down. Yeah.
And turning your attention again to the conversation you had with Mr. Lister and I on May 30th, 2019, do you recall that for some reason you weren't notified for 2 or 3 days after the discovery?
I don't think that was correct.
Well, that is what you told Mr. Lister and I on May.
Stand that. But
Okay.
I'm not sure that's correct.
You're not sure what's correct or
2 or 3 days later, because they went up there, they found some bones, they brought them down, and when we met with the anthropologist that confirmed that, yes, they were human, I was there when that happened.
Right. But I'm just asking about when you were initially informed, and as you told Mr. Lister and I, it wasn't until 2 to 3 days after they were found. But you've also told this jury it was 2 to 3 hours.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Could have been 2 or 3 hours, could have been 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
But ideally, as the coroner who's got to make these determinations as to cause and manner of death, you like to get this information consistent with Colorado law as soon as possible.
Yep, sure.
And after this first set of remains are found, can you explain to the jury what process you undertook in your investigation to determine cause and manner of death of Dylan Redwine?
We met with the anthropologist, and who confirmed that, yes, they were human. And then they were sent off for DNA testing. And it was confirmed to come back as Dylan remains.
So that's the process you undertook after the first set of remains, have the remains identified as human, have DNA confirm whom they are.
Correct.
Did you partake in any other investigation regarding this first set of remains?
No.
And do you recall, when I'm referring to these first set of remains, how much matter, how many bones we're talking about?
I don't remember.
Now, you talked to the jury, all of us, about what a coroner does, and this is foundational and leading a little bit, as to cause and manner of death. Can you explain to the jury what cause of death means, what manner of death means for a coroner?
The cause of death is...
I'm going to ask you to lean into the microphone like I am. You're doing great.
The cause of death is what happened to cause the death. whether it's a natural death, medical issue, a traffic crash, blunt trauma, whatever. The manners, there are 5 manners of death, and that is natural, accident, suicide, undetermined. There's one more.
Homicide?
Homicide. Yep.
And can you define for the jury what the term homicide means for a coroner and how, if at all, it differs from how the law defines that?
Homicide for me is the individual died as a result of actions of someone else.
And is that the beginning and the end of that definition?
In the end, it's very short. It's caused by someone else.
Does that mean when the coroner uses the term homicide that she is inferring what? Motivation, mental process, or why something happened?
No. That's up to law enforcement to determine who and what was the cause. I could have an individual that was in a bank, and someone comes in to rob the bank, and that individual dies from a heart attack. That is a homicide.
Even though the bank robber didn't do anything to the poor person who had the heart attack,
correct.
They go in, the person has a coronary.
Yep. Right. They died because of their action to come in to rob the bank.
So it sounds like it's, though a short definition, a very, very, very inclusive definition.
Yes.
Because it doesn't get into the mental process, motivation, or anything like that, right?
No.
Now, initially, based upon your interactions with the postcranial remains, those bones we've been talking about this morning, you issued an initial pending certificate of death to Dylan Redwine, correct?
Correct.
Permission to approach, Judge.
Yes.
Defense 1917.
Oh, that's not copy.
And without discussing the substance, the words of what's on this document, does defendant's 1917 look like a fair and accurate reproduction and representation of the pending State of Colorado certificate of death that you drafted in this matter?
Yes, it does.
Move to admit, Judge.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Admitted.
And looking at the bottom of the form that you filled out, you actually signed it as well, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what's the date on this? Or did we not get the date on this document?
I don't. Oh, December 27th, 1919.
Say that one more time.
December 27th, 1919.
How about 2019?
Oh, 2019, correct.
And Judge, this looks like it's a poor quality copy, and I think counsel would probably agree with me. That actually says 2013.
Well, you got to dance with who brought you to the ball. I'll agree to that. I don't think the date's dispositive here, Judge.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Besides that it's in this century.
Mr. Bogan, how much longer are you going to do?
5 to 15, Judge?
Be on the shorter side, please.
By all means. On this pending certificate of death, what did you determine as manner?
Undetermined.
And what did you determine as how injury occurred?
Undetermined.
Now, eventually you issued an official death certificate, correct?
Correct.
Permission to approach with 1918 defense, please, previously. Yep.
The judge will stipulate to the admission of this document.
Okay, 1918 was admitted.
Ms. Smith, was this the first official death certificate for Dylan Redwine?
Yes.
And again, that was issued and signed by you?
Correct.
And where it says manner of death, what was your determination?
My signature's not on here.
Was this the one that got issued by your office?
It probably was one that came through the mortuary.
Okay. And what does it list as manner of death?
Homicide. Oh, no.
Yes.
I don't have my glasses on, so I really can't.
You want to get your glasses?
No, they're out in my truck.
You want mine?
Maybe.
It would help. Just don't. That help any? Oh. No?
Okay, manner of death could not be determined.
And cause of death?
Undetermined.
Now, eventually, you filed the forms to, quote, correct a Colorado death certificate in this case, correct?
To amend, yes.
I'm sorry, speaking to the microphone?
To amend?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. And you did amend it from undetermined to homicide, right?
Correct.
But explain to the jury whether or not that was a process that you had to grapple with, given the state of evidence.
Definitely.
Explain to the jury why you had to grapple with it.
Well, I had to make sure that what I had or what I knew was the death occurred because of the results of someone else's actions.
And after, when the final death certificate was issued, was that before or after the partial cranium of Dylan Redwine was found?
After, I believe.
And
had to be.
Did you ever see the partial cranium?
Yes.
What were those circumstances?
I met with the investigator and the anthropologist at the hospital so we could x-ray the skull. And there were some marks on the skull that we found.
And it's your testimony today that you had the opportunity to see the partial cranium, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you do recall you did talk to myself and my investigator, Mr. Lister, on May 30th, 2019, correct?
I don't remember the date, but yes, I talked to you.
Right. And when we were talking to you about this issue, I asked you, at what point did you become aware a partial cranium had been found? And you said, quite a while later, I never saw that.
Oh, well, I was
And then-
mistaken because I did. We met at the hospital.
And then I asked you, you never saw the cranium? Your answer, no.
I was wrong.
So when you're speaking to Mr. Lister and I, you were wrong in your facts.
Correct.
No further questions, Judge.
All right, we're going to take a early recess, so we'll start up again at just after 9:30. So everybody rise for the jury. You may need them again. Just you can go. Yeah.